Okay, thanks for having me. I'm going to be talking about this. I'm a recent invitee to this. I was on design reviews at Harvard about a month ago with Charles. And he said, "Oh, I'm doing this thing on the Pay Master Plan. It'd be much more fun if you came too." So somehow I got signed up. And I've done a deep dive about this since I got tapped to participate in this, so I really appreciate it. I'm very interested in the process that led to the redevelopment of Wybosset Hill because I've been involved with the two other major urban redevelopment projects in New England, Boston City Hall and Plaza and Government Center. We're doing the Boston City Hall and Plaza master plan right now for the city of Boston with Reed Hildebrand, and are pretty deep into that process. And also, I did a lot of work with the city of Worcester 5 or 6 years ago to unlock some of the potential with the City Square project to undo some of the master plan, CERT's master plan for downtown Worcester. So I, through those projects, have done a lot of historical research about the impetus for the original projects, what the rationale was that caused them to happen in the first place, but also the fascinating history of the politics and the eminent domain tools that allow these things to happen. And in fact, in the slide that I'm showing, you can see that the level of destruction of the three cities was about the same. All of the projects ranged from 35 to 50 acres. So there was obviously a federal sweet spot in terms of the size of the projects that seemed to work from project to project. The other thing that's fascinating about this is that modern urban design, Harvard claims, was invented at Harvard University in 1956 by CERT. And it's no surprise that the three important New England projects were done by CERT, Harvard professors and their proteges as part of the project. So Harry Cobb was chiefly the designer of the Government Center master plan. Some associates that were working directly with Pay were the authors of Wybosset Hill. And CERT did the first master plan for Worcester all about the same time. The timing for the CERT plan was a little bit later, but it had an earlier incarnation. The impetus for the projects was partly financial. There was federal highway money, there was federal housing money, there was federal urban renewal money, and the sweet spot was if you had housing in your project, the site was blighted, and you could make an argument that there was a transportation piece for highway access. And if I go back to the three projects, you'll see that a new highway is looming just in the background. So that need to connect new interstates with interchanges to arterials was part of the rationale for these projects and part of the way that they were justified through grants and through applications. And so you can see 295 just at the top there. Urban renewal in Worcester was between that and the downtown and the Common. And of course 95 coming through Providence, and then the central artery, and then the connections to the roads to make that happen. This cartoon in the Worcester newspapers sums it up. The ever-growing auto traffic, and Worcester's #1 problem are historic buildings in the way. It literally says that right there. But there was a lot of rhetoric and advocacy around the need to, because the downtowns were historically decaying because of post-World War II, the GI Bill, the growth of suburbia, the invention of the modern shopping mall, regional shopping mall outside of downtowns. And civic leaders were in a panic that downtowns were being hollowed out by a lack of economic development activity. And one of the root causes, they thought, was the inaccessibility of downtowns and the lack of parking. And so that that argument, which persists today, I'm still a planner, there's still questions about traffic and parking, so I guess it makes some sense to me, resulted in that. It says, streets built for horse and buggy traffic, and then the car can't fit. By the way, that's a downtown Worcester in the early 1950s. So the consequence of that, beginning really in the early 1950s, were a series of urban renewal projects that began a little bit more on the periphery of downtowns, a little bit more at the fringe where there was industry, and then through the late 50s and early 60s, these projects with confidence moved right into city centers. So the first urban renewal project in Worcester wasn't where I showed you the photo, which was here, but at a kind of fringe area along the tracks. But the before and after, and lots of posters and ads in newspapers about the advantages of the before and after, talking about traffic, and appealing to citizens for the good of the city to approve these projects. And so this is, again, the same view looking in downtown Worcester over the town hall and the common. This entire neighborhood was removed for urban renewal, quite dramatic. Now, of course, the same story plays out in Providence. These are some photographs of the situation of Wybosset Hill looking west on Westminster, Wybosset coming to the intersection in front of the cathedral, and Broad Street running off this way. These are two photographs looking back down the hill where Wybosset and Westminster would intersect there. A popular view in postcards, by the way, because there was a view of church steeples back down the hill. And that situation today, which follows the logic of the projects in the other cities, a desire to create super blocks and pedestrian precincts as a way to get people to come back to the city. So a lot of the logic of these projects was the need to get people off the highways, into parking garages, and on foot to experience the city separate from the automobile. And the model for this was the European city, that kind of romance, the Italian piazza, and a way that the city could be reclaimed. So this is the PAYS plan for the Wybosset Hill redevelopment area. It's 39.2 acres. It includes, as a centerpiece, a pedestrian precinct with automobile traffic around the perimeters, and that in progress. You can see the traces of Wybosset Street here. These blocks between Green and Empire happened earlier. It was a little bit like live TV planning. The plan in the works, while the plan was in the works, these projects were already happening. This is a view pulled back of, again, the beginning of the implementation of the plan. And so I was curious about this. I couldn't get my hands on the original master plan report, so I emailed Harry Cobb. And I said, Harry, could you see if Pay Cobb Freed has the master plan report in the archives? And 2 days later, a PDF arrived in my email. So this is the original cover, the cover of the original master plan from 1962. It was revised for some reason in 1963 in March. Very interesting. The setup for the plan was organized around the topography of the city and that place in the city at Empire Street where the grid and the kind of flat area of the downtown began to climb the hill, and the streets started to move in diagonal directions to settlements far and wide, Old Neeville and other directions. So there's a discussion in the master plan about that hinge in the city plan and a rationale for why maybe redevelopment would make sense there. This sets up the context at the time. The old location of 195, that's more or less finished. It looks like 95 in this photograph is under construction. And there's promises of an east-west connector that was supposed to make its way behind the train station all the way across to the east side. Luckily, that never really happened. And that is called the Central Interchange. And then the plan itself was really conceived in two parts. A residential quarter that was meant to, this is very thoughtfully written in the master plan report, complement the commercial district, the shopping district, and to get people living again downtown. And then a whole convention tourism development that has grown and developed some steroids now, but the first pieces are there. A sports arena and an exhibition hall that has become the convention center. And it was also tied to the implementation of turning Westminster into a pedestrian mall. So the logic of the plan was only to continue that a pedestrian precinct at the center of the downtown, up the hill, culminating at Cathedral Square, with Jackson Walk as a kind of tributary off of that. Very interestingly, this is true in all of the literature of all of the master plans we've looked at in Worcester and for Government Center in Boston too. There's a direct reference to European plazas as pedestrian precincts as a model to solve the American city. These are all diagrams from Camille Cite's 19th century treatise on the good design of plazas, which influenced the shaping of the plaza by Pay's office. This is a rendering from the time that many of you have probably seen. And then a description about the two sub-districts that were part of the plan. The original proposal had 555 residential units, and very different than what was finally eventually built. These were mostly proposed to be row houses with individual entries. I think the townhouses that Pay designed at Society Hill are more what Pay's office intended than what the development entities that ended up executing the plan ended up building. And this is the Convention, Sports, and Travel Center. Many of you remember the round building that used to be there that was torn down relatively recently. Somebody was asking me the other day, what was that for? And I said, you don't remember when you would use the AAA guides or the mobile guides to drive around America? Like there was a whole era when you would actually stop at rest areas and get directions. So that was the vision for it. It was designed to be seen from the highway at the pivot, and it was originally planned to have this enormous antenna on top of it, a beacon at night that you would see from all over New England. It's described here. The antenna gets a whole paragraph. And so there's the antenna on the rendering. But you can see that these are actually townhouses that have individual entries around the perimeter of the blocks. They have private gardens in the middle of the block, and then surface parking lots hidden on the inside. So from an urban design standpoint today, they would probably be successful socially. The problem today, or the challenge today, is that both residential buildings that face the square itself turn their backs, except for one entry to the square. There's a lobby entrance, but otherwise there's a kind of no man's land of landscape to the windows of the units. And then the slicing and dicing to make this happen. There were 132 parcels within the redevelopment area, and they ended up with 24. So a lot of the strategy was to reorganize the parcels to make them attractive to the market, to make them the kinds of parcels that a range of developers through an RFP process would apply for. What you see is the design and design controls, which were very light. I mean, one of the interesting lessons of the plan is that without a finer grain of design controls, the final execution of a plan can be less successful than the original vision. So the design controls are really about number of units per acre as a way to fix the building types. It's before form-based code, if you're into that stuff. And so these are designating, it's hard to read, how many units per acre you could build there. And the townhouse areas, which are these hatches, they were called out as townhouses, but they weren't built as townhouses, were designated at a very low number of units per acre, only 35 to 40 dwelling units per acre, which is quite a low density. And then a high-rise was planned here to terminate Jackson Walk as a kind of architectural feature. And then there are controls about lot coverage, controls about where you can have parking and service access and where you can't. And then a whole transportation plan that's predicated on a series of one-way loops that were meant to make their way around the pedestrian precinct, both for Westminster and for Cathedral Square. So this was set up as the pedestrian spine, with these streets as a kind of logical loop. And this was completely reworked as part of the plan. I guess there used to be a rotary here, but I can't find any photographs of it. But Atwell's was disfigured and bent to get the hotel to fit. That's what happened. This street used to come straight this way. And then finally, the real estate deal. These were the parcels that were available. And so 1 through 24, what you could build on them, their size. This became the real estate prospectus. This was what it was available with a kind of menu of the possibilities. And this served then as the basis for the build out of the parcels. One interesting thing about the plan that is worth noting is the Bosque of Trees that were built in that square area there. There's a group of trees there, a kind of shady area, was originally meant to be a civic or institutional building that would have changed radically the sense of space of Cathedral Square, and maybe would have made the scale of the space better than the space that bleeds all the way back to the residential building. So at some point, I guess they couldn't get a developer to do anything there. So in and maybe Charles will tell us about this, in Bob Zion's design for the landscape, maybe a decision was made later to turn that into a landscape feature and not a building. So why does this all matter? I think that if the city and advocates and citizens are going to think seriously about what to do with Wybosset Hill and Cathedral Square, I would recommend that there be a very close look at Pay's original plan to see what the original intentions were, to see if there's any clues or any inspiration about maybe strategies for improving the quality of life and the uses in the area. That's the first thing. The second is that, and Charles is going to talk about this, I'm sure, the best cities are a palimpsest of their long history, and I think that whatever decisions are made about, particularly this part of the downtown area, should reflect and preserve some aspects of what was finally built. Because I think the other choice is to either turn the clock back or to impose other kinds of ideologies or other kinds of styles onto the district. Although there's been some very smart planning relatively recently about what to do. One idea was to cover 95 within the territory of Wybosset Hill to cap that. It'll never happen. You can't finance it. Tip O'Neill made it happen in Boston. It'll never happen again. To reconnect the South and West End to the neighborhood and to open up Westminster Street again through the Cathedral Square across. So, and then ideas of even turning the bridges over the highway into kind of Ponte Vecchio experiences that kind of disguise the highway to make those connections. I think they're actually all good ideas, but these plans, I would say, wish away some of the cultural history of Pay's plan and some of the legacy of it, which I think some of the residue of that should probably remain in whatever happens. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Charles.
Well, good evening. As Tim mentioned, we were sitting next to each other, I think it was maybe 4 or 5 weeks ago, and it's amazing, Tim, what you've learned in such a short period of time, so thank you for taking the time to do that. What I'm going to do is kind of zoom in on landscape, but zoom out to look away from Providence to see what's happening in other places. And one of the things that I wanted to share is before I came on this trip, I had seen this online. It had popped up, I don't know, a couple of months ago, and it had caught my attention, and then I had since heard about the funeral, which I am so sorry to have missed. I send my condolences. And then I arrived at my hotel on Wednesday, and I looked out the front door. And I mean, I've seen kind of dangling teeth before, but this image of, and it's still there. You can still see text dangling. And then I got back to my room today, and on my bed was what I thought were going to be chocolates or mints that hadn't arrived the 2 days before, but they were actually earplugs. And then the earplugs were sitting very nicely as if they were pretending to be chocolate-covered mints. And I had a dearest guest note. And I'll just skip to the second sentence. And it says, the 49-year-old John E. Fogarty Human Services building located across the street from the Dean Hotel is being demolished by way of a high-reach excavator. And then this is the interesting part. It says, completed in 1967 and designed by architects Castellucci, Galli, and Flanca, as the State Welfare Office, was Providence's best example of brutalist architecture. And I had to laugh because the first time I saw Tim present publicly was at a conference that we had done now about 6 years ago. And I want to say that Tim was involved in an exhibition at that time, and we were using different language other than brutalist, and why brutalism gets us in trouble. It's hard to love the word or the idea of brutalism. But I was intrigued also that here was this place that told us this story. So I'll let you know how the earplugs work in the morning. And with that, this is actually something that I've pulled out of the pay report that Tim was nice enough to send to me. And this is a photograph that I took on a cold Wednesday this week. Today that space is a funnel through which pours the traffic of 5 streets. In the plaza, the rerouting of automobiles to other local streets permits the formation of a pedestrian oasis, attractively paved and embellished with sculptures of fountain, trees, and special lighting standards. The Cathedral Square will become part of the Weybosset community, if only. Now, what's also interesting is a few months ago, I received these images from Sarah Bradford. And these were some renderings done by Derek Bradford at one point when there was a revisitation. And you can see that it's basically, the can opener approach, open it up, and pedestrianize it. Now I see Mac Woodward here, and his name was mentioned earlier, and I want to say when I spent 15 years at the National Park Service, I came out for the unveiling of a publication, which you see very small on the bottom right-hand side, called The Historic Landscapes of Rhode Island. And the 2 statements that are here are from that publication. The state of Maine was the first state, to my knowledge, in the US that actually attempted to create context statements so that landscape architecture could be nominated to the National Register. I show this because this publication now is 25 years old. The word modernism, for example, does not appear in this publication. That the people that we're talking about here, like Pei and Zion, were at the top of their game. And so I think there's some need for us to also kind of fast forward, and in some cases, in the case of Bob Zion, who's been dead since 1999, that there's a need for us to kind of contextualize the legacy. So I think the first thing is that when we hear the word modernism, and I think there's always what are we talking about? And so what I want to give you is my sort of way that I look at modernist landscapes. So it begins first not in the early 1940s, as books like Invisible Gardens suggest in the US, but it begins here in Maine, in Camden to be precise, and the Camden Amphitheater, the first revolutionary use of a bent axis in a public landscape, 1928-1929 by Fletcher Steele. During this period, we have Mr. Zion himself being asked by Mr. Paley to curate an exhibition called New Parks for New York. This ultimately leads to the creation of Paley Park, and among many other things, the idea that we can actually have movable chairs in the public realm. The other thing that happens on the left coast at this time is Lawrence Halpern and his celebration of the kaleidoscope of life of cities, followed by freeways 3 years later. And Halpern himself also is the first to really look at the idea of recycling landscapes and buildings together with the architect William Worcester at Ghirardelli. There are many books before the Preservation Act of '66 in this small window where they speak of recycling structures. The thing that I find exciting as a person who comes at it through the landscape architecture realm, it was the landscape architect, Halpern in this case, that realized that part of the recycling process was the idea of putting 4 levels of parking below as a way to begin to look at how to repopulate the building as a festival of experiences. Also, we see the recycling of the street at the Fulton Mall in Fresno, which is just now, as we speak, sadly, being opened to traffic. That's another story. But I think what they have in common is that in all of these projects, there are historic structures that intermingle with the palimpsest that is the new landscape. And then for me, I bracket the end of this period, not because I was a fan of Lucy's Bicentennial Minute or Lava Lamps, but with the bicentennial, and to a large part what Nancy Hanks was doing with the National Endowment for the Arts. So we have tall ships here in Boston with the Sasaki Dawson DeMay plan for Christopher Columbus Park. We have Halpern's Freeway Park, which I would argue is a possible World Heritage Site as the first capped freeway in the world, to my knowledge. We have Bob Zion in the Waterfront Park in Cincinnati, so perhaps this is a period where Bob Zion is having a romance with the French curve. It's what Paul Friedberg would call limp-wristed modernism. And this, believe it or not, was designed not just to be able to be an amphitheater, but it was designed for 50-year floods. We have Philip Johnson at Thanksgiving Square in Dallas. We have one of the only extant playgrounds by Noguchi in Piedmont Park and Olmsted Brothers Landscape in Atlanta. Halpern again striking in Fort Worth, Texas, although it's a bicentennial project, it doesn't open until 1980. And then what's interesting is that when you think about the value, these are all places, you probably know many of them just looking at the images, but what they all have in common is they were selected by the AIA for 25-year awards, which means that the AIA works with the Library of Congress and the National Park Service to document those buildings. So when a 25-year project is recognized by the AIA, it becomes part of the permanent fabric. All of these places have significant landscapes. In cases like Dulles, it is now lost. It was designed by Dan Kiley, and there is no record. You can see Pei at the bottom for his work at the National Gallery. So why do we have different standards for architecture and landscape is the question. When a place like the Salk Institute puts a new landscape in place with new buildings, there's very different standards for the architecture than there are for the landscape. In the case of the Kimball, where Kahn, working in partnership with Harriet Patterson, and you look at the 14-foot-long drawing that underpinned their design, this sectional drawing, it was to be the villa in the garden. And then when we go there today and we see the piano expansion in that space, why is it that there isn't a value, a design value placed on that open space? Why is that the sacrificial lamb in these projects? And so the question is, what do you do here? What's important from this project? And so what I'm going to do is zoom in more on the space itself than the development and ask what is the context that is necessary to understand when making planning and design decisions to go forward. Now, to step back first, what's intriguing to me, and I think this is to me very different about Boston and New England, is that on one hand, as we have the kind of large-scale scraping that we just saw in Tim's presentation, there is this kind of conversation that's happening about the past in all of this work. I first noticed this, I don't know how many people are familiar with the general plan for Boston, but you see this idea of change and continuity, the word contiguity. These are terms that you don't often see in documents that have a heavy urban renewal focus. Now perhaps because there's a lot of these people are commingling at Harvard and MIT, that there's a lot of people who are writing during this time. And history, landscape history in particular, is also penetrating everyone's DNA. Diane McGuire's doing this at the Radcliffe seminars. Al Fine comes to teach at Harvard. It is the centennial of Central Park. And what does he do? He curates an exhibition. And what I find interesting is the people who are the very junior students that work on this, Julius Fabos, John Furlong, Terry Schnadelbach, Bill Tischler, Joe Volpe. I'm sure many people in the room know these folks. They tend to deal with large-scale landscapes in their lives, but they're also interested in landscape history, and they all publish extensively. And so there is, again, this ability to look back, to look forward. We also see that Joe Hudak, who was at Sasaki's office for many years, was involved in Fairstead becoming a National Park Service unit and a National Historic Site. By the way, they did spell Olmsted with an A when that happened. You see projects like Commonwealth Avenue being as much about modernism as they are about restoring historic fabric. Quincy Market is another perfect example. And then you see the language in larger planning studies. Here, for example, in Cambridge Places, something old, something new. Quote, old, dense, exhibiting continuity and change, subtle and obvious, intentional, cosmopolitan, sometimes village-like. Cambridge, Massachusetts remains a three-dimensional synopsis of American urban life. I think you could say the same about this precinct. You see this idea of the communal landscape and going back to Quaker origins being played out at places like TAC with architects and landscape architects collaborating. I found myself thinking about this as I looked at the European village concept. When I saw Tim's drawings earlier, I can't help but think of Kevin Lynch and the kinds of drawings you see also in Gordon Cullen's books. And this idea of, when I went out into the square, to see this kind of urban stratigraphy that's going on. And I actually think, and perhaps I'm being naive here, but I wondered if this railing was not really put here to actually make it safe, but it was put here to draw attention to it. And I couldn't help but think about the kinds of church experiences I've seen in Rome, where you see this idea of layer upon layer, and then creating this kind of narrative that really wasn't here, that buttresses the space that you've just experienced. Now, the other thing I just want to say about this period is that what I just showed you was really, although it was happening, that I find that most of the publications tend to focus on the building as object. So for example, when you see the architectural surveys, the Boston City Hall work doesn't talk about Sasaki's contributions. The Utilitarian Meeting House says nothing about the landscape architecture. Surt's work as well at Boston University, the dormitories at Colby, American Can, these all have landscapes associated with them. Occasionally, Sasaki Dawson DeMay is mentioned. Friedberg might be mentioned. And again, Sasaki Dawson DeMay, but by and large, not. And so it remains invisible. So I guess the question is, how do we move from the shadow of this architect as we look at this precinct and begin to value, in this case, the work of Zion and Breen? When we're thinking about Rudolph's work, again, how do we move away from merely looking at this as an architectural expression? So what I'd like to do with the rest of my time is just very quickly give sort of 5 things to be thinking about to begin a conversation. The first is this idea of designation, and is that possible? The idea of context, documenting the work, educating owners, and then this idea of the palimpsest, or how historic preservation and design go hand in glove. Now, what's interesting to me is that as you scan the National Register, there's over 1,000 buildings that are less than 50 years old that have been designated. You're very hard-pressed to find landscapes. And in the case of Philip Johnson, for example, I was intrigued to even see in the NHL nomination in '86. So think about Johnson's still pretty productive. He's part of that NHL designation. As I mentioned earlier, in the Historic Landscapes of Rhode Island, 2001, the survey was done between '88 and '90. So all the people that we're talking about today are all still practicing. Over 1,000 buildings, as I mentioned. Perfect example is the Eames House, which is as much about the site as it is about the design. It does not have significance in landscape architecture. And when you go back and look at the Schindler House, you look at the Neutra House, you look at the Stewart Pharmaceuticals, where actually there's 3 pages in the nomination about Tommy Church's work, but then it just basically says, not his best example, we're only going to designate Ed Stone. The Sea Ranch, miraculously, where Halpern was involved for more than 30 years. When you go to the condominium complex, in that frame view, for example, which is a piece of art really created by Halpern, only the architects are recognized in the designation in 2005. And then what's interesting to me is something started to shift. And it happened because of historic houses and because of the indoor-outdoor relationships. First with Philip Johnson's Glass House, Columbus, Indiana, and the Miller properties, the Gropius House here in Lincoln, and finally and most recently Manitoga in 2006. All of these places have been viewed with architecture and landscape and sometimes other disciplines all recognized as part of their significance. And we then saw this trickle effect go outwards. In 2000, we had the first designation of a Tommy Church project working at GM. Dan Kiley at the Air Force Academy, and Kiley has 5 National Historic Landmarks. And then we saw a project that was actually threatened with demolition in 2010. This was, again, the same period that we're talking about because of road expansions and urban renewal. This was one that Halpern was involved in. It was going to be demolished. And not only was it not demolished, but it was rehabilitated, and I'll come back to that at the end. This is the work of, I mentioned earlier, in Halpern, the progenitor of the ideas of the FDR Memorial all play out here. This was the work of Historic Fort Worth, who basically had to file a lawsuit through a Freedom of Information Act to find out what was going on and to lead to this is the first Halpern landscape designated in the US, sadly a little more than a year after he passed. In the city of Boston, when Ellen Lipsey was the Boston Landmarks Commissioner, I thought this was a big move that we saw a local designation of a work of landscape architecture at Christian Science. And then in 2013, everything changed. We saw the progenitor of the Park Plaza with PV Plaza in Minneapolis by Paul Friedberg, Haig's Gasworks Park. Haig, incidentally, was a classmate of Bob Zion's. The Portland chain of open spaces were listed on the National Register, and then finally the Camden Amphitheater, which was already on the National Register, became a National Historic Landmark. So I think there's been a lot of change since the Historic Landscape Survey in 1991, and I think there's an opportunity for us to view this project through those opportunities. So what is the concept for a project, the context for a project like Cathedral Square? And it's interesting when you step back and start to think about the urban renewal efforts and the idea of the piazza, which Tim mentioned Boston City Hall. I'll throw the Embarcadero into the mix. Halpern was at Harvard with Pei and others, so they were definitely all drinking the same Cert Kool-Aid at the same time. But I think that there are, as we move away from just looking at this space, I would argue that Christian Science is a potential National Historic Landmark. I think the Kennedy Library as well, in terms of Pei and Kiley. In Newport, Rhode Island, Christopher Tunnard's design. And even the Sod Maze by Richard Fleischner at Chateau Semir. Constitution Plaza, which still has a high degree of integrity in Hartford. And that brings us to Weybosset. There's a great quote by Robert Zion in a monograph of his work. He says, speaking to the goal of the project, to create in the foreground to the cathedral a piazza on a grand style to accommodate large crowds for church ceremonies. A fountain resembling a form seen in Japanese gardens and intended to attract the eye even when water is not flowing is the main feature of the square. I was in Japan for the first time 4 weeks ago, and on my last day there I went to see the Silver Pavilion, not knowing that in fact this was clearly going to be the space that had inspired Bob Zion. And when you look from above and you start to understand the curve of the steps, and there of course is the form itself. Now in addition, I would say that this project ranks high in Zion's career. I already mentioned the Waterfront Park and Paley Park. He also worked with Johnson on the MoMA Garden. These are seminal projects, and I would say the Weybosset Commission is in the same league as these other works. So I think one of the things that should happen, irrelevant of what happens to this resource, is there should be a documentation effort. There is something called the Historic American Landscapes Survey. I was at the University of Rhode Island yesterday and saw a student presentation of a Warren Manning Arthur Shercliffe project that's just been documented to HAL standards in Westerly at the library park. And I think that there are people within the ASLA that would be interested in doing this, and the work is usually done in a pro bono capacity. So why should we do that? Well, here's why. Here are examples of projects that in the last decade have all been demolished that are significant works of landscape architecture. And what they all have in common is none of them were documented beforehand. We started to see a shift also during this period, beginning with the Park Service's documentation of Independence Mall. Skyline Park by Halpern, which was a 1974 project, was destroyed but documented. PV Plaza, this documentation was key in leading towards its National Register designation that I mentioned in 2013. And so all of that, I think, is one way to also build a bigger tent and to build a cadre of people who are interested and care about the space. Number 4, educate owners and public stewards by establishing creative partnerships. And I wonder if there's a way for some kind of group to be formed, whether it's informal as sort of a de facto coalition, if you will, not really a conservancy, but a group of interested parties, perhaps spearheaded as a special initiative by PPS and other groups, to begin to get a deeper understanding of the hand of the landscape architect in a project like this. I mentioned Skyline Park, and here we had students from 2 universities that did the HAL's documentation standards, and by the end of the project, the students were saying, why is this project being demolished? We published a monograph called Lawrence Halpern's Skyline Park to actually document and do a post-op to say, are we better today? And we also wanted to daylight a scheme that Halpern did that was never really shared, where he addressed the issues to open up the park and things that were of concern that really never benefited from a public discourse. Here's an example of a group that came together called the Northside Leadership Commons. They were going to demolish this trapezoidal water feature. People wanted to bring back what was the more, quote, Olmstedian Lake Elizabeth that you see in the top right-hand view. The park had been drained during the Second World War for storing scrap metal, and then the north side of Pittsburgh had become so rough and tumble that people had forgotten about this space. It turns out that it was designed by the late John Simons. When this was listed on the National Register in 2015, the period of significance spanned 100 years, going back to the original plan by Mitchell and Grant as the oldest mapped parkland in the city, and then embracing the master plan of 1966. In the case of Lawrence Halpern's work in San Francisco in the Tenderloin, in the Embarcadero, here was a grassroots example where a group came together, this woman, Mary Millman, who ran the Green Market, to basically, you could see in this earlier shot, the fountain had been closed off because people were bathing in it. It stopped functioning. And if you go there today, it's working once again because of this community coalition. And I think probably the best example to point to is what's happened in Portland, Oregon, under Randy Gregg and others that have founded the Halpern Landscapes Conservancy for the Portland chain of open spaces. This was a dance festival where they had between 4,000 and 5,000 people on a weekend, where they recreated Anna Halpern's dances in the fountains on the 40th anniversary of the chain of open spaces. Everyone went in at the end. I was there. It was a lot of fun. And then finally, this idea that historic preservation go hand in glove. Sadly, this is an example of a Halpern design. This is, I mentioned earlier, Freeway Park, and you can see where over time the kind of trapezoidal paving patterns were disappearing as a way to open up view sheds because people didn't feel safe. I especially like the dog poopy dispenser on the left-hand side. And then also during this time, there was a proposal that came along because something happened. There was a woman who was actually sadly murdered in the ladies' room at night, a homeless person. And then there was this knee-jerk reaction to go in there and just lop off a third of the canyon fountain. by a different PPS organization. And when I saw their schemes where they just sort of, there was no understanding of the design intent, I couldn't help but think, you know, if this was the burgers of Calais, would we kind of casually go through there and start editing burgers? Would we say, oh no, let's have a burger that's less scary? Now, I know we're being silly here, but I think it's very easy when you look at schemes that happen in projects like this, there's an immediate knee-jerk reaction to edit. And I think we move towards scrape very rapidly in projects like this. And I would just give a word of caution there. And for me, this is what had happened with PV Plaza on the left-hand side. It was a scrape before, and candidly, it's the only time the foundation at this point had filed a lawsuit. We partnered with the Preservation Alliance of Minnesota, PAM, because we felt the landscape was significant enough. And now there's a rehabilitation scheme that is advancing. I also want to mention that these were pro bono drawings done by Paul Friedberg's office for us. They were to illustrate concepts. When people were saying, well, you know, these projects are not accessible, you can't program certain kinds of events. And I think that I wanted to show this because I do think that there's not a love. I don't think anyone's shocked to hear me say there's not a lot of love for this space here. And you've got to rebuild that relationship. And I think it's important to think about that graphically in terms of showing how certain types of things could be accommodated without getting rid of it. This was an important thing that happened for us in this process, because what often happens is the newspapers print the really depressing images of water features that don't work, benches that are broken, graffiti, so on. This was the case with Park Central Square, and I just wanted to show that this is kind of what had happened. There was a downtown department store that had been derelict. A developer came along and said, I'll turn this into housing, but you've got to redo the square. And they came along with this plan. You see the poor little fountain on the left. This was phase 1. This was phase 2. None of this happened happily, and it was designated. The park has now been rehabilitated, and I think it's a win-win. In the Charlottesville Mall, as well as another good example, it didn't fall onto the same tough times, but I think part of it is getting people to see what makes a design unique. And in the case of this project, Beth Meyer at the University of Virginia and students, along with other people, did community outreach, they did dance performances, they did an exhibition to really illustrate why that the bricks that were uniquely 2 by 14 inches were central to the design because they were a key feature. And I would say that here in the square, that the hexagonal pavers are as important. Here you have Bob Zion, who comes from New York City, taking the hex pavers that were introduced by Robert Moses when he worked with Clark and Rapuano and using clay versions instead of asphalt. And then they seamlessly are part of the fountain as well. Paving is really key in this design. And then finally, just some before and afters, because I think that the kind of can opener approach that's necessary here is what Rios Clemente Hale were able to do at Grand Park in Los Angeles. There are now elevators and ramps and staircases. The fountain that existed as an object, not to be experienced, is now a center of energy in the space. I think this is a great success story, and it's been a real game changer in downtown Los Angeles. And that's what I've got, so thank you.